Today's story is about something truly extraordinary. An election held not in quiet towns or bustling cities, but in muddy trenches, smoky camps, and even behind enemy lines. Imagine casting your vote while bullets fly overhead, your uniform soaked from rain, and your future uncertain. Yet thousands of Union soldiers did just that in 1864, determined to have their say in the middle of America's bloodiest conflict. This wasn't just patriotism, it was political warfare. This is the story of bayonets and ballots, the election behind enemy lines. In November of 1864, the United States found itself in the throes of both a brutal war and a critical presidential election. For the first time in American history, the nation was choosing its leader in the midst of an all-out civil war. The stakes? Nothing less than the future of the Union itself. President Abraham Lincoln, weary but resolute, was up for re-election. His opponent, George B. McClellan, a former Union general turned Democratic candidate. McClellan promised to negotiate peace with the Confederacies, something that could mean recognition of the South's independence and the preservation of slavery. But Lincoln had a problem beyond the battlefield and the ballot box. Nearly 500,000 of the men eligible to vote Union soldiers were scattered across distant battlefields. Entrenched deep in enemy territory, hundreds of miles from their hometown polling stations, without their votes, Lincoln feared defeat. Back home, political divisions were sharp. Northern Democrats, often called Copperheads, openly criticized Lincoln's handling of the war. Many accused him of being a tyrant, of violating civil liberties, even of prolonging the war for political gain. Meanwhile, Lincoln's supporters, the Republican-led National Union Party, saw the war as a moral crusade, one that must end in Union victory and the abolition of slavery. As the election loomed, Lincoln confessed to a close friend, "I am going to be beaten, and unless some great change takes place, badly beaten." The war had dragged on for 4 long years. Casualties were in the hundreds of thousands. The country was exhausted, and the president's popularity had plummeted. But what if the very soldiers fighting that war could vote even from behind enemy lines? It would take new laws, bold logistics, and the courage of thousands of men in blue uniforms, willing to carry their democratic duty into the heart of war. Because this was no ordinary election. This was a battle for the soul of a divided nation. As the 1864 election approached, a question loomed. How could soldiers vote while serving far from home, some deep in Confederate territory, others in mobile camps on the move? The answer came through bold legislative innovation. Several northern states passed special absentee voting laws, some for the first time in U.S. history, allowing soldiers to cast ballots remotely. It wasn't easy, and each state handled it differently. In Pennsylvania, soldiers could vote by proxy. They sign an authorization form and entrust someone back home to cast their vote in their name. In New York, special election officials were sent directly to military camps. Ballot boxes were hauled over rough terrain, under threat of ambush, just to reach men in uniform. And in Illinois, Indiana, and a handful of others, paper ballots were mailed to the front, a radical idea at the time. Soldiers welcomed the chance. For them, this vote was personal. They had seen comrades fall in the mud of Antietam, bleed out in the wheat fields of Gettysburg, and endure freezing nights outside Petersburg. Many believed that if Lincoln lost, the war they had sacrificed so much for would be abandoned. All of it would have been in vain. But it wasn't just about logistics, it was about trust. Would commanders tamper with the vote? Would ballots be counted fairly? Some worried the military environment would pressure soldiers to vote for Lincoln. Others feared Democratic ballots might mysteriously go missing in transit. Even Lincoln himself was concerned. He issued orders that no one should be coerced into voting a certain way. "The ballot is a stronger weapon than the bullet," he once said, "but only if it remains free." Despite the challenges, the military voting effort pressed forward. By early October, hundreds of ballot boxes had begun their journey by wagon, by train, even by courier, toward distant battlefields and field hospitals. And across war-torn landscapes, something remarkable began to happen. In muddy tents and makeshift cabins, surrounded by rifles and ration tins, Union soldiers sat down, some with trembling hands, to mark their ballots. Not with fanfare or celebration, but with solemn purpose. They were voting, quite literally, in the shadow of death. As Election Day neared, November 8, 1864, the Union Army became something no one had imagined just 4 years earlier: a mobile voting population. And with that transformation came scenes so striking they seemed pulled from fiction. Picture a smoky Union camp outside Atlanta. The ground is wet, the sky steel gray. Soldiers are gathered not for battle, but around makeshift ballot tables, a wooden crate here, a supply box. There under the watchful eyes of state-appointed clerks in dusty civilian coats. There are no flags waving, no campaign signs. Just weary men in blue coats, some missing limbs, others missing friends. Each quietly waiting to mark a slip of paper that might determine the very course of the war they've been fighting. And yet, despite the solemnity, a quiet energy pulses through the air. Discussions break out between friends and messmates. Some support Lincoln with almost religious conviction. He's the only one who won't make peace with slavery. One soldier tells another as he tightens the strap on his satchel. Another grumbles, "McClellan at least knows how to fight this war. Lincoln just reads scripture and signs death orders." Many of these men had once served under McClellan himself, back when he commanded the Army of the Potomac. They respected him as a general, but his politics now gave them pause. While McClellan ran on a peace platform, he also claimed he wouldn't accept disunion. The contradiction confused some and worried others. Still, political identity among soldiers wasn't uniform. Letters home from this period show a surprising diversity of opinion. Some soldiers felt Lincoln had overstepped, trampling civil liberties and prolonging the war unnecessarily. Others feared that a McClellan presidency would mean surrender, the undoing of every sacrifice made since Fort Sumter. But one thing was nearly universal. They knew this vote mattered in a way no vote ever had. Around campfires, debates raged. Was Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation a stroke of moral genius or a reckless political gamble? Would peace really follow McClellan's election? Or would it only embolden the Confederacy? In hospitals, soldiers too weak to stand dictated their votes to attendants who marked ballots on their behalf. Some men died before their ballots could be counted. In field headquarters, officers double-checked vote tallies, made sure every name matched muster rolls, and sent sealed returns back to their state capitals by courier or train. The risks didn't end at the battlefield. Raiders had targeted supply lines before. What if they captured ballot boxes? Despite it all, the process unfolded with remarkable order. State by state, the votes were collected. New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, and more, each tallying soldier votes separately and adding them to the civilian returns. And when the results began to pour in, something extraordinary happened. Soldiers had voted overwhelmingly for Abraham Lincoln. In some regiments, Lincoln received over 70, even 80% of the military vote. The very men who had trudged through blood-soaked fields, who had buried brothers and faced Confederate fire, day after day these men had chosen to stay the course. Their votes made a difference. In several close states, including New York and Pennsylvania, the soldier vote helped swing the margin decisively in Lincoln's favor. Had those votes not been counted, McClellan might have taken those key states and, with them, the presidency. For Lincoln, it was a vindication. For the nation, it was a moment of clarity. Even in war, democracy could survive. Even from behind enemy lines, ballots could speak louder than bullets. As the final tallies came in, the message was clear. The Union would not waver. The soldiers had spoken not just with rifles, but with votes. They had chosen to finish what they had begun. When the final ballots were counted, the results stunned even President Lincoln himself. He had won, and not narrowly. Abraham Lincoln secured over 55% of the popular vote and a landslide in the Electoral College. 212 votes to McClellan's 21. The message from the North was clear. The Union would press on, and the war would be fought to a definitive end, not negotiated into a fractured peace. But among all the votes cast that November, one group stood out: the soldiers. Lincoln had received nearly 80% of the military vote. Think about that, for 4 years of war, after Gettysburg and Shiloh, Cold Harbor and Chickamauga, after seeing firsthand the cost of every order from Washington, these soldiers still believed in the man who had sent them to fight. They didn't see a tyrant. They saw a leader who refused to let the nation be split in two. For Lincoln, the victory was more than politically douce, deeply personal. In the months leading up to the election, he had prepared a letter to his cabinet admitting defeat. He had been ready to concede power peacefully in the middle of a war. Instead, the people, especially the men in the trenches, chose to give him another chance. But Lincoln's re-election came at a steep price. In the South, Confederate morale was shattered. Southern newspapers called the results a declaration of unending war. Many in Richmond had pinned their last hope on Lincoln losing, on the North growing tired, on compromise rising above conquest. With that hope gone, Confederate leaders realized what lay ahead: total defeat. Meanwhile, for Union soldiers, Lincoln's win didn't bring immediate relief, didn't shorten their marches, warm their tents, or heal their wounds. But it gave them clarity. They weren't fighting aimlessly. They were part of a republic that had, even in wartime, held a free and fair election. No military coups, no postponed ballots. There's no dictator in the making. Just a battered but enduring democracy. Torchlight parades filled the streets. But Lincoln remained solemn. "It is not in my nature," he said, "to exult over any man's defeat." He knew what lay ahead. The war still had months to go. Cities would burn. Thousands more would die. But now, with the people's voice behind him, Lincoln would push forward with a new clarity of mission: the preservation of the Union and the complete abolition of slavery. In his second inaugural address, delivered just months later, Lincoln's words reflected the pain of those years and the deep cost of that vote. "Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue, till every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword." This was said 3,000 years ago. So still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Behind those words were the voices of the soldiers who voted from hospital beds, muddy trenches, and firelit camps. They hadn't just cast votes, they had cast a verdict on the very meaning of America. And it was a verdict that would echo long after the last cannon fell silent. As the winter of 1864 gave way to the brutal spring of 1865, Union soldiers continued their march not just toward Richmond, but toward the closing chapter of the Civil War. Victory, long elusive, now seemed inevitable. Lincoln's re-election had set the course. The soldiers' votes had spoken. The war would be fought to completion. And slavery would end, not with a whisper, but with the roar of a constitutional amendment. But the impact of that wartime election didn't fade with the fall of the Confederacy. In fact, its legacy would reach far beyond the battlefield. The 1864 election was a turning point not just in the war but in the story of American democracy. For the first time, a nation proved that elections could go on even amidst civil conflict. It was a dangerous gamble. No other democracy in the world had tried such a thing. Most had crumbled under civil war or postponed elections indefinitely. But the United States held firm. And not just firm, adapted. The soldier vote wasn't just a bureaucratic novelty. It was a revolution in how Americans thought about participation. The war had stretched the limits of what was logistically possible. States had to invent new processes. Election commissioners rode trains through dangerous terrain. Clerks sorted mail-in ballots by candlelight in tents, far from the state houses that once handled such things. In a very real way, modern absentee voting was born on those bloodied fields. But it was more than ballots and laws. It was a test of faith in a system and a nation. In the idea that even amidst gunfire and grief, a free people could govern themselves. Years later, many of those same soldiers would return home, shattered in body but firm in purpose. Some became lawmakers, others educators, many just fathers and farmers again. But they all carried one shared memory. That moment when rifles slung over one shoulder, they took a folded piece of paper and helped shape the future. And what of Lincoln? Just 5 months after that historic election, he would be gone, struck down by an assassin's bullet at Ford's Theater. He would not live to see the reunified nation flourish. He would not see the Freedmen's Bureau take root, or the 13th Amendment enforced. But he died knowing that the people, especially the soldiers, had chosen to finish the work. In many ways, it was their votes that gave him the strength to see it through. So when we speak of democracy's endurance, of its resilience under pressure, we often think of fiery speeches, of grand court rulings, of waving flags. But sometimes it is found in quieter acts, in a tent in Tennessee or a trench near Petersburg, where a wounded private folds his ballot and drops it into a wooden box, not knowing if he'll live to see its result, but believing it matters anyway. Because democracy isn't something we inherit, it's something we fight for. Sometimes with bayonets, sometimes with ballots. And in 1864, American soldiers proved that both could be wielded in defense of a nation's soul. And that's the story of how ballots marched alongside bayonets in one of the most pivotal elections in American history. If you found this story compelling, there's more where that came from. Subscribe to us Civil War History for weekly deep dives into the untold moments, forgotten voices, and turning points that shaped a nation divided. Don't forget to like, share, and ring the bells so you never miss a story from the front lines of America's past.